We have a great conversation and a bunch of hosts or a bunch of panelists today with us. We have Joaquin Altoro, who is WHEDA's CEO and Executive Director, Milwaukee native. We have Thao, and she is also from WHEDA's Assistant Deputy Director, and Kristen Hardy, who's at Legal Counsel for Briggs Stratton, and hosts one of my also favorite programs when we used to be able to go in person, Brunch of Professionals. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to kind of handle this conversation, as I told you before, as kind of stepping out of the way and letting you guys take over. And if I need to interject, you can do so. There is a chat function. If you want to post a question, I will get to those at the end. Also, this is on Facebook Live and being recorded, so I'll be monitoring questions the whole time. So I will just start, Kristen, with you. What are your thoughts on what's unfolding across the country over the last week? And then everybody can kind of answer that afterwards.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for having me on. I first should say that all my opinions are my opinions and they don't represent my company. As far as my thoughts, I really struggled to effectively articulate my thoughts and emotions surrounding the murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, and then the subsequent protests that have ignited around the globe. I guess in a word, I am tired between this and the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities in Milwaukee and my hometown of Detroit. I feel very emotionally drained. And while I really appreciate the outpour of words of encouragement and support from a lot of organizations, I can't help but notice the irony when I look at the composition of these organizations. So it kind of reinforces the importance of going above and beyond paying lip service to diversity and inclusion. For me, this shows us that we really need tangible, consistent actions, which we knew that already, but across the board, not just in organizations and not just with the government, but we really need serious actions all the time.
Yeah, Kristen, first of all, I want to say hello. This is our new where we have never actually met in person. And so when I knew that I was going to be on kind of a panel and speaking with Kristen, and I kind of saw your background, I'm like, how have I not had the opportunity to meet somebody with such an impressive background? So it's a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you.
And Mainza and I, we go back, first of all, because we worked with each other at WHEDA. And I will share the same as you had mentioned, that my opinions today are solely my opinions and do not reflect that the state of Wisconsin nor the WHEDA. But all that being said, I think most people know that I'm very comfortable in expressing, some of my feelings. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why I'm in the position that I'm at, because I've been able to most times clearly share. This is, I'm going through all kinds of emotions. And I think maybe that's not new, but I'm actually going through some new emotions through this, because it's been interesting. And even in this case here is that I've been asked in many places and spaces, Joaquin, what do you think? But I haven't seen those that are not of color asked in such a passionate way or asked pointedly what they think also. So Jeremy, I challenge you to make sure that you're a part of this conversation also. It matters because you are influential. You represent, groups and people, and I welcome you to feel comfortable to be a part of this conversation because you are amongst friends. And so I will pause there, and I don't know, Mainza, if you wanted to talk.
Yeah, I think, both Kristen and Joaquin have said, it's been really very emotional, personally and professionally. On a personal level, it's truly how do I show up? How do I use my privilege, my platform, right, in a way that can truly affect change versus, Kristen, to your point, just the words of support and encouragement. How do I truly show up for my community? And my community is also my African American community, but also internally at WHEDA, how do we show up as an authority whose mission is to address disparities, especially disparities around housing, which is where we find safety and protection, right? And so these are all conversations that we are currently having, and Joaquin and I have been very emotional in these sorts of conversations with our own folks at WHEDA. So for me, I think personally, I still have a very heavy heart, but I'm reaffirmed more than ever now that we are, those of us who are committed to this work, that we are going to really affect change from this point on out.
Go ahead, Jared.
I guess since you're bringing up work, in your just WHEDA's role, and if people don't know what WHEDA is, it's the housing authority that does a lot of great work across the state. Let's talk about about equity and equality in housing. I mean, it's a huge issue. If you guys have just addressed that quick, as one of the underlying things that impacts everyone.
Yeah, quick, right?
Well, yeah,
no,
quick.
I get it. So WHEDA stands for Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Authority. We do a lot to bringing resources for single-family homeownership or even affordable housing, and then supporting small business. The tying thread between all that is that we try to bring these resources to communities that are low and moderate income. When we look at those places throughout the state, and especially in Milwaukee, when we go to rural communities, we usually see farming communities. And then when we go to some of our urban communities, that's actually changing in rural communities. But when we go to our urban communities, when we look at low and moderate income, it's usually a majority communities of color, right? And so we usually, in Milwaukee, in Racine, and some of our other cities, when we look at one's income and they're below the average income, what we're seeing is it's a majority African American and Latino. So the challenge for me as I thought about this and getting into this position is the fact that first of all, understanding what disparity means, and then understanding that it impacts, regardless of race, it impacts a lot of different people. But in a state where, forgive me if I'm not quoting these numbers exactly, but in a state where we're maybe 90% white, but then when we see in our urban communities where a majority of, maybe closing in on 90% of folks that are in urban communities are of color, that are impacted by poverty, that's an interesting disparity. And so how do I work as a leader of WHEDA to not force but compel folks that maybe are not of color to say, this is a disparity, we should not pick and choose? How do we work on these disparities in urban communities that impact directly African American and Latino issues?
Kristin, what about the intentionality of equity and equality in your work and personal life? And I mean, obviously, some of the social things you create, some of the programs you create to be inclusive of the community.
Sure. So hopefully I don't bore everyone to tears, but I do want to talk about some of the numbers in the legal profession. Yeah. So despite numerous diversity and inclusion efforts and statements and initiatives, the legal profession continues to be one of the least racially diverse of any profession out there. Last year, I wrote an article for the Wisconsin Lawyer magazine entitled, "Don't Forget About Women Lawyers of Color." And in it, I discussed how women attorneys, and I focused a lot on African-American women attorneys because our numbers are the most dismal, are often shut out. And I don't think it's always intentional, but we get grouped into, there's a group for women and there's a group for the minorities, and then we fit in both. So we kind of get shut out, not to mention all the, double barrel bias and different kinds of bias that affect us. So we get shut out of these efforts, and that means we get shut out of opportunities for growth in the legal community. So interesting statistics. According to a 2017 American Bar Association lawyer population survey, only 5% of active attorneys identified as Black or African American, despite at the time, I think it was around 13% made up the country. So those numbers don't sound terrible. But then when you look into law firms, and in the article, I really focused on law firms because the numbers, we have good data in firms. Minority women make up a meager 8% of US law firms. And that's compared to 35% or around 36% of all women. And again, I mentioned that African American women, there's a dearth there, and that's usually because, I mean, it's for multiple reasons, but excuse me, our numbers are like 0.1% or something. It's like the numbers are embarrassingly low for how many African American women are in law firms, and even worse at the partner level. So looking at these dismal numbers, that means I always care about equity and equality. When I think about equity, that's plainly fair and impartiality, and then equality, we're trying to level the playing field in terms of race, status, and opportunity. Maybe this is a pessimist view, or maybe this is controversial, but I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to truly and effectively level the playing field. With a litany of discriminatory practices and laws aimed at stunting the growth of African Americans and minorities in general, socially, professionally, economically. I think it's easy to see why I'm coming to that conclusion. But of course, that doesn't mean we don't still try. So what are some things that I do, particularly in the legal community? I think we have to look at the pipeline, and I think everybody on the call would agree with that. We have to start early with elementary, middle school, high school, but really at I think third grade is the level. I know for STEM, I think it's around third grade when that's when kids start really getting interested in something, and that can change the course of their lives. So right there, I think we have to show our faces. We have to be in the classrooms. The Wisconsin Association of African American Lawyers, I have a shirt on if anybody wants to purchase one. Shameless plug, but WAL has a mock trial, a high school mock trial program that was, the initiative was started by Corey Ashley, which many of you know her in the community, and she's been doing it for 2 years. And that's getting our faces as minority attorneys in these schools so students can see us. And maybe they don't do law, but now they know professionals who look like them, who come from their same communities, who are doing this work. Another important thing, eliminating the economic barrier to education. So going back to WAL, we raise money for scholarships every year. So we give away around $14,000 in scholarships to African American law students at Marquette and University of Wisconsin. I think all of us do a lot of this work where we're serving on panels or in organizations. I've been in leadership with my employee resource groups at my previous company and my current company, and that gives us an opportunity to be heard. You know, I'm not representing every African American person or attorney, but I can make sure that our issues are being heard. So that we can try to guarantee some equity and equality if people are thinking of initiatives and they're not necessarily thinking about us. So those are, and then of course, a bunch of professionals. Jeremy mentioned we partnered with Milwaukee for the past couple of years for Young Professionals Week. Myself and Makta Fesahai, who's also an attorney in Wisconsin, and my good friend, we started this organization about 6 years ago. And the goal was, I'm not from Wisconsin. I graduated law school. All I know is lawyers. Okay, lawyers aren't that interesting. I'd like to know different people in the community. So we do these brunches every month, or at a time they were every month, where we sit down with women and we discuss real issues with professional women. Every now and again, we open it up and we invite the guys, and that's why we had this whole big brunch with Milwaukee. We try to partner with organizations to talk about different things that afflict us in the profession, and then just to get to know each other. You know, we partner with we're trying to infuse business in all of our restaurants. So Screaming Tune is an excellent partner where we've done some of our big brunches there. We've hosted a brunch at practically every restaurant in Wisconsin that offers brunch. So that's a really fun time, more shameless plugs. But those are just ways that, you know, you don't go into that thinking, oh, I'm looking at equity and equality, but you do learn more about people and understand them and associate with them so that you understand some of their issues. I just think that makes us more vulnerable as people. And it's an important aspect of kind of what I do and what I'm trying to do in the profession.
Yeah, the conversation around access and exposure, access to opportunity, exposure to different opportunities of either industries to work in, exposure and access to being able to run for office. You know, I'd like to take a little bit of a historical approach to this. And Kristin, before we started, I heard you mention that you're not originally from Milwaukee. You are.
Correct.
Where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Detroit.
So, gosh, I visited Detroit and learned so much about their history too, and I'm sure there's a lot more to learn But historically, a good amount of folks don't know that at one point in Milwaukee, we had a very healthy and a very wealthy African-American community. If you do some of the research and see some of the history around the great migration of African-Americans from the southern part of the United States to obviously the Midwest, you know, Milwaukee was one of the last cities to receive this beautiful gift of the African-American community. But when they did arrive, they arrived to jobs. And then what happens with jobs, right? Then there is the creation of community. There's the creation of entrepreneurship. There's the creation of so many things. I fell into a book. It's called a Green Book. You remember the movie that came out recently, The Green Book? I fell into one that was given to me by a friend that was a Green Book for Milwaukee in, I wish I could give you the date, but let's say late 1930s, early 40s. And I was so amazed at this book, but at the same time, so disgusted by the book. And let me tell you why. It was a directory of African-American owned businesses. And the book was this thick. Can you believe that? Like if we did this book today, we probably could do it on a couple sheets. It was this thick. Everything from attorneys to those that fixed vending machines to, I mean, just name every aspect of business that was there. I mean, it existed when there was an opportunity for jobs and wealth creation and opportunities were there, hope was there. And when I saw this book, I could not believe in my eyes that this was an existence in the city that I grew up in, and that now I am in today. And so now we wonder, after all these years, that when a disinvestment happens, and when we see jobs leave the city, but the people stay, and when you know, Kristen was talking a little bit about kind of the systematic things that happen, the policy things that happen. You may have heard we've talked about redlining, where banks and insurance companies and even governments, they created policies that kept people in places, didn't allow them to move and create choices as to where they wanted to go. And then jobs leave. You don't have to be sophisticated in thought process to understand, what happens and what continually happens? And then how does frustration continue to grow? How does health lower? How does education lower? How does despair increase? How does hopelessness increase? And then, you know, we're just talking specifically to the African-American community. For purpose of this conversation, it's very important for folks to know that my mother is Mexican and my father's Puerto Rican. And so what we ended up seeing then is shortly after the migration of the African-American community, we saw the Latino community come in. And the only place that the Latinos were able to, first of all, some of the first Latinos to come to Milwaukee were Mexicans. And they came to work with some of the early jobs that were still here before they disappeared. But the only places that they could live in were places where already the constructs of these rules were, where obviously it was crappy housing and some of the jobs left and the education wasn't in line. And so, you know, you can see that when you come into a place of despair, what do you expect for communities to feel like? How do you expect for them to eventually respond? To bring it back to, I think, the reason why we're talking, what does this have to do with the senseless murder of a beautiful Black man? It has a lot to do with what we're talking about. Yes, there was a death. Yes, there was police brutality, but I hope, in my opinion, this has nothing, or this does not have only to do with police brutality. It has a lot to do with frustration. And now we see the growth of other communities, i.e. the Southeast Asian community. And I find it really interesting when Mines and I sit down, how we begin to see how a community that became through refugee status in maybe the mid 80s, and Mines, I hope you don't mind me passing it over to you, because obviously you have a much more expertise in it. But now we're seeing a ridiculous growth in that community. But where do you think, and what do you think is going to happen? I always said that I as a Latino should work closely with the African-American community and understand the disparities, because at some point we will see that happen to the Latino community. if we can learn and understand from these issues and we can use those case studies to improve the Latino community, then that would be absolutely wonderful. And we are now starting to see this. If you want to see my point in case, look at the COVID cases. Immediately we saw a spike in the African American community, and now in the state of Wisconsin, Latinos are, you know, at just unfortunate higher levels than most races in the state of Wisconsin. Mainza, do you mind if I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about how now you and the Southeast Asian community has as a part of this conversation?
Mm-hmm. No, and Joaquin, thanks for, bringing up the Southeast Asian community as well as just the Asian American community. I think these are trying times for everyone. I think every community is reacting from a place of pain and hurt. And right now, so COVID-19, right? Along with the pandemic, the physical illness itself of the pandemic was the anti-Asian sentiments that came from that. And then now with this whole continual, movement of how do we support our Black and Brown communities, especially our African American communities now, we have so much more of an understanding of how do we all, as different communities, different cultures, how do we come together to unite? Because to Joaquin's point, this affects all of us, right? All of us who come from marginalized communities, especially communities of color. And if we don't unite now, when are we ever going to come together? Because racism, injustice towards anyone in particular affects every single one of us. It's going to come around and kick us in the ass, excuse my language, right? But I think what we're also seeing come out is the pain from, so the dynamics between communities as well, right? The perceptions or misunderstandings between our own communities as well, such as communities feeling like, well, Asian Americans have never been here for us, so why should we be here for them? And vice versa. And there's all these layers and layers of pain from communities. And how do we get past these pains to see the bigger picture of what we're fighting against? And that's where I think there continues to be, we need to keep having dialogue with each other, having those real, honest, crucial conversations. And how do we all begin to heal together so that we can remember who and what we're fighting against?
I think a lot of people want to know solutions on what we can do as a society, maybe tactically or maybe systemically. I've heard a lot of different, obviously, if you're on Twitter or any social media, there's so many different opinions out there. I just like to take time and think, what can be done tactically or maybe on a policy level, whether that's state or local or even federal, that you guys have, or any of you have been thinking about?
Forgive me for just jumping in. Maybe I can get this started. I think it's got to be burned from both ends. I'd like to start maybe on an individual level. I've been asked a couple times, we've had some hard conversations with friends and at work, and I've had some white folks ask me like, what personally can I do? So I'd like to start on a level, but I do not only put this on only white folks. It's on all of us folks. But I think I want to address that because I've been asked that quite a few times around that, and I think it is a time of introspection. And as a time of introspection, I remember there's just so many things that I want to say. I would say as a time of introspection, I would first understand how are you showing up and who are you relating with. I find it interesting that we will have people be in support of in any way possible, either by doing something on social media, signing the bottom of a letter. But if you just take a moment to look on social media when they decide to spend time, their free time, who are they spending with, and how are they showing up with that? So the question is, and this is actually a challenge to everybody. When was the last time there's Kristen, you and I think all three of us we probably could say that there's a lot of times that we're saying we've been the only one in the room for many times. I ask folks, when's the last time that it's been flipped around and you were the majority in a room, you know? And how many cases does that happen? I can actually say that with my Hmong brothers and sisters. I've been there business and in personal and in celebration, and I was the only Latino in the room. I can say that with my LGBT community, where I've been there in business, in partying, and in planning, and I was the only in the room. I can say that with my Muslim brothers and sisters. I can say that with my Black women. I can say that with just young children. I mean, there's so many situations where I can in a healthy nature say that I was the only one. There's been many a times when I've been in the room and have asked someone, especially someone white in Milwaukee, where we get down to it, and I asked them, when was the last time you've been in a room with a room of all CEOs and they were all of color? It changes the game.
It does.
You think differently. In Milwaukee, I haven't. It's kind of crazy when I'll go to DC or when I go to Detroit and when I go to Atlanta, I want to and when I'm in those rooms, it's a culture shock. So I was in Atlanta and I went to a coffee house, a hipster coffee house, and it was all Black hipsters. Do you know that I had it was a culture shock and I was bothered by it? I was bothered by it. I walked in, I was like, no, this ain't right. Like, this is supposed to be white. Like, what? Confused.
You know, it's really, not to cut you off, but it's so funny that you say that because, so like I said, I'm originally from Detroit, and a lot of my formative years were spent kind of in the suburbs of Detroit, Metro Detroit. And if you look at the numbers, those areas are allegedly segregated. But if you asked any of us who grew up in those communities, they're far from it. I grew up with, and I've been to many bat and bar mitzvahs. I have lots of Middle Eastern friends, lots of Asian friends. That was the standard. And if you talk about, my high school friends, we talk sometimes like, we didn't realize that the world was not as diverse as our community was. This was very normal to know all kinds of people from all different backgrounds. And even when I go home, I'm so used to in Milwaukee, I'm a big foodie. No, that's no surprise to anyone. So I like to go out to eat in Milwaukee. That's my favorite thing about the city. It has all this good food. It's great. And I'm used to being the only, you don't pay attention to it after so long. You forget that you're maybe the only African-American person kind of occupying these spaces at any given time. But then I go home and it's such a noticeable difference where I'm like, oh, this is someone that's different than me. Look at all these. It's like I lift my head up and I look around and I'm like, I forget that this is the community that I'm from that looks so different. So it's so funny that you say that, Joaquin, because I have experienced it firsthand, and I've texted my friends like, or I've taken some of my friends from Milwaukee to Detroit. We went there last summer. And just, it's a different scene. Detroit is different than it used to look. But in a lot of ways, it's a lot of diversity there. And I think Milwaukee has that in it. The diversity is already here. It's more about us having the opportunity to occupy those spaces. And I think a lot of it, back to your point, it starts with checking ourselves, educating ourselves, checking who are the people that we're hanging around. I love that point about when's the last time you were the only in the room, because I guarantee that, a lot of people can't say they've ever been the only in the room, which all of us have done that many a time. It's our life. That's the work that we do. So yeah.
And I want to bring this back to the workplace, right? Those of us who are in organizations, and we have the influence, we have the authority, we have the power. We had an all-staff meeting yesterday, and Joaquin was talking about all that's happening right now in our world. And Joaquin made a point that it was like an aha moment for me, which it shouldn't have been, right? But it was. It's how do we as organizations, we're here to serve. We're here to serve all of our communities in Wisconsin. And if we are those organizations who are here to address disparities, have we truly taken the time to reevaluate our products, our services, our customer service, whatever it is? Have we taken that time to reevaluate how those products and services are truly serving our communities, are truly having the real impact that we conceptually think we're having around addressing disparities. And I think that's how we start. Organizations, corporations, that's how we need to really start operating is, let's be honest, what real impact are we really having, especially in regards to addressing disparities? Because again, as we all have said throughout this conversation, it's despair upon despair upon despair, because nothing has truly been addressed and nothing has truly been fixed, right? It's all just been, just we'll throw it here, we'll throw it there. It was multiculturalism before, then it was D&I, and now what's it going to be, right? But we have never gotten to the root of it. And part of that needs to come back to the onus of all of us who are in these organizations that are supposed to be doing work around disparities. And we need to really have those honest conversations. Are we truly making an impact? Where can we do better?
Kristen, I learned something the first time I went to Detroit was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and I changed the way that I became a banker because of my visit to Detroit. I went to Detroit with just kind of these really large open ideas around how can I can save the world and stop racism and stop disparities. And then I went to Detroit and I physically saw it looked like a nuclear bomb was dropped on it. And it looked like a nuclear holocaust, some of these neighborhoods where it was blocks upon blocks upon blocks of empty houses. And it just was so overwhelming that I just was so confused that on my drive back, I decided to change the way that I will be a banker and the way that I will be responsible in creating resources for my community. No longer will I be concentrating at such a 10,000 foot level thinking that I can change the systems, because you can actually change things with small wins and low hanging fruit.
Absolutely.
I'll give you an example of that. Right now, one of the things that we're doing at WHEDA, because there has been national studies and state studies about disparities of African American and Latino homeownership, and homeownership of the white homeowner and the non-white homeowner. And if you look at it, you're going to think it's impossible. How in the world are we going to get folks to really have any type of an impact over that? And to me, when I drive down a block on the north side of Milwaukee, there are blocks that there's not one homeowner. And if I could have just one homeowner on a block, it changes the fabric of that neighborhood. That is the way that we need to look at going forward, how we can have an impact. If we get so caught up and stuck in the heaviness of despair, ain't a thing gonna change.
Yep.
And so, for me, as I think about leading this authority in the state of Wisconsin around, some of these issues, what I did is we started talking about pillars at WHEDA and what motivates us in the way that we move forward. And one of them I chose was wealth creation and wealth sustainability, because that is something that gets directly at disparity, but impacts almost everybody regardless of race. And I've challenged my organization not to just pick and choose where you want to be able to have an impact.
Yeah.
You got to make sure that we have that impact across the board. And so that everything we do, and so that when Mines is working on procurement and we are spending money with women-owned, veteran disabled businesses or businesses of color, that we are in mind of the fact that we want to build their capacity and their wealth to be able to sustain, because then it allows them to do, like I told you the story of our African-American community, the beautiful gift given to Wisconsin is the African-American community back in the 40s.
Yeah.
So I'll pause right there.
No, that's an excellent point. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, except mine was more pointed to the legal community, but we can't get caught up. I mean, it's really easy to put these statements out and to say we have make a page on the website and say we care about diversity, or even throw money at it and think that throwing money fixes the problem, which it doesn't. You have to fix cultures, and to me that starts with really understanding. And if you really go out and meet people where they are, and who these people are, the legal community it has so many rigid standards of who fits where and who goes where. But I think if we step back and really understand people and their backgrounds and value that diversity, we'll make those changes. And I've said this on social media a couple of times since everything kind of has blown up. it's different ways that you can be an advocate. It's different ways that you can fight the good fight. Everyone, whether it's because of a job or it's because of physical disability, they can't be on the front lines protesting. That may not be the way they're able to help, but you are able to, volunteer your time. You are able, this is really simple, educating yourself, reading, talking to people, and not necessarily putting the onus on minority communities to do that heavy lifting, but just to understand what's going on. And I just feel, I know it's not as easy as I'm making it sound, but to me it seems so easy. Meet people where they are, understand their background.
But it could be that easy, right, Kristen? Like if each of us do our part in just being intentional. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. Can we be intentional with meeting folks where they are? We have had conversations internally about all of us. We are all at different places and spaces in our lives, but where can we create that space in between? It's not an all or nothing, right? Where can we create that space in between to just be intentional? It is that simple. Can we just be intentional with building relationships? Can we just be intentional with doing business with diverse-owned businesses? Can we just be intentional about how we ask interview questions when we're recruiting? Can we be intentional with how we promote folks within our organizations? It can be that simple.
Yeah, we live in a city still where we don't have an African American in this, a woman in that, a Latina in this. We're still at a point where we have none. I did my unscientific survey about a year ago to figure out how many of color do we have an executive level in banking in the state of Wisconsin. And I came up with close to a flat 0. And when I meant executives at executive level, I meant truly, it's not giving you a title, because they'll give out titles real quick at a bank, but truly those that have the ability to have strategy and an impact on the financials of the business itself. And there was nothing. And I got to a point stating, I've been in this game for about 28 years, and I bring a significant value in understanding all the communities that I spoke of before and more. I've created value at multiple banks and increased their bottom line, and have had no ownership and was never given an opportunity to be at an executive level in a bank. And so when I did that, I was like, do I want to be the first? I actually got so frustrated, I started looking outside of the state of Wisconsin and saying, maybe it's my time to be able to leave the state. That's another conversation, Jeremy, that I know you've led many a time in the state about us keeping our brightest, I thank Governor Evers for tapping me in this role, but this role is not a forever thing. And so you could see that, I'm going to be working very hard to make sure that I get as much as I can in learning how to be a real good leader. But even so, what's been interesting, and you guys, every one of you probably got to be able to identify that. You know how many people have told me, Joaquin, you got your future planned out easy, man. Now you got this job at WHEDA. Like the next job, man, you don't have to do nothing. Like as soon as this is done, like everybody and their mama is going to call you and you're going to be perfectly fine. That's all I got to say. There's a reality to that. There's a true reality to that.
Yep.
Reality to that. I told you I did my unscientific survey already. So, the reality is that we want to work. There's just so much that we can do, I think. But let's not get caught, I guess, in the fog of the disparity. I think there's things and there's ways that influence and power in the city and the state can really give people that opportunity to really make things a change. I think I'm an example. I would have never thought I'd been in this position, but so privileged is the fact that I've been given, and now I promise I'm going to do this state well. And it's going to be it's going to benefit everybody.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few minutes left here. I did want before I go into some of the questions we received, you guys all touched on a little bit, like almost displacement from disinvestment is what's happened a little bit. You also talked about D&I in the workplace and a lot of these things that, I think one of my frustrations when I hear a lot of D&I programs is a lot of it is lip service and there's not a lot of action. And then you you kind of dive a little deeper, and it was a program that was set up in a company, but it never really had the resources behind it to succeed in the first place. Can anyone address that? Like, I've seen it for the last 10 years of working with a lot of talent initiatives, and it's always just frustrating when you see like a C-level executive say, D&I is something, and for those that don't know on the call, diversity and inclusion strategies are important to the company, and then you look at, well, what are the resources behind it, and it's like there's like one person, and it's one person's job, this is everybody's job at the company. Can you guys just talk about that a little bit? Maybe everybody's kind of chuckling.
No, we agree with you, Jeremy.
We do. Yes.
We all see these. And I want to be really clear that I think a lot of the times they're well intentioned. I really believe that people have good intentions, but we know what they say about good intentions sometimes. So these items need teeth, and I can rant. And like I said, I'm the immediate past president of WAL. So as the WAL president, I was ranting and raving about this on a consistent basis about we talk about wanting the legal profession to be more diverse, but you don't hire us. And I can ask the question directly in that capacity, okay, what's the problem? Well, we don't have any talent. We don't see talent. What does that mean? I know talent. I see talent. I see all these beautiful law students graduating every year and leaving our state. All this talent is leaving the state. So sometimes I think and this is tough, and I'm not necessarily advocating for anyone to do this, but it does take someone to call people out on their strategies. Because again, if you're well-intentioned and you think you're doing what you can do, but that's resulted in one African-American person and one Asian person at your firm in the last 20 years, I mean, maybe we can do a little bit better. And sometimes it wakes people up. Like, oh, you're right. We don't have any African-American attorneys. I can provide you all the support and we can throw money at the situation, but you're right. We don't have any. And I didn't notice that. Thank you for reminding me. And then you see, an influx of African-American or Hispanic or Asian attorneys. So I think it takes someone being bold enough to call them out. And I don't even know if it's courage, but it's more so the willingness to call people on what they're doing and say, this has no teeth. Like, we see it for what it is. And I don't think I'm really clear about not putting that onus on our students because they're trying to get in these spaces, but it's up to the leaders in the community, the leaders in the legal profession to do some of that work.
I would just quickly add that I truly believe that and this discourages me, all right, because I also oversee our culture work at WHEDA, and it's a little discouraging in terms of just time, but I believe that it all comes down to the individual, and that change has to happen at the individual level because culture is built on individual behavior. And so some of our strategy is how do we affect change one individual at a time, which is the discouraging part because that is a lot of time investment, right? And the hope is that they will slowly come around and word spreads and the energy spreads, the synergy spreads. But I truly believe that the shifting of mindsets has to come at that individual level. And if we don't dig deeper and invest at that individual level, any organization, any group, we will not move that needle. We could participate in trainings, we can mandate all we want, but it's got to come back to that individual, that introspection, and that realization that I belong to a bigger community than myself. And it cannot be self-centeredness alone. It's got to be who is in this world with me, who is in this community with me.
We're up against time, but I do want to get one last question in here. Probably won't get to all these, but a question from Larry is, how do you feel about the idea of, this is really direct, how do you feel about the idea of defunding the police departments and of funding social programs that are known to be effective? If anybody wants to take that.
Well. It's not an either or, I can go off on a tangent about how social programs are not effective, and then who's going to determine if they are, right? And at the same time, for defunding police, such a controversial, tough topic to be able to discuss. But at the same time, I have brothers that are of color, that are police officers, that need support, that they know that they themselves need training, and that their personal brothers and sisters need better support and training. So that's not an easy one. It's not an easy topic. I think there just has to be a better accountability, but not just of police, of where we spend our money socially on social programs. So tough question. That's the best I can do.
What about even, I feel like there's a lot, I mean, in the private sector, we talk about disruption all the time, but in the public sector, we never talk about that as a term that we want to happen. And, maybe it is time for some of these things to have major disruption. There's a lot of ideas obviously floating around there of things that can be done on the police level. What about having each district be voted in, a public official as the head of it? Therefore, they have to get input from the community. They have to go, instead of just being appointed, or not that that's the only solution, but I guess maybe you guys can address the question or even go into maybe other ideas for it.
I'd like to say something. I want to be respectful to you both first, if you want to mention
something.
Please. So the concept, I'm going to actually answer that a little bit differently. The concept of disruption is a beautiful one. Remember that what we ended up doing is we ended up losing the entrepreneurship as a concept. We lost it when we lost jobs and we lost so many things to our community. And so I think investment in teaching people that there's different ways to disrupt systems. Protesting is one way, but really thinking about innovation, knowing that there's different ways of disrupting, that process, that educational process is the place where we need to start. That's the one thing that I've been asking our community, is that we're so quick to throw money at startup businesses and say, hey, we'll give you a loan. But you know what? We just need to invest in telling our community, so this is what it means to think entrepreneurially. This is what it means for you to think of a new idea and to support it and sustain yourself. So the concept of disruption, that needs to be taught first before we begin to even go into the level of, why don't we just start taking this particular idea or this space and disrupting it? Because when you empower the people to think differently, then I think you'll see mountains move in the city and in state.
Yeah, good point. Any other last minute thoughts or things you want to say before we sign off here?
I want to quickly say, I just want to reinforce the idea of the importance of educating ourselves. It's easy to form an opinion or tweet something or post a status when you don't have a true understanding of situations. So, just talk to people, educate yourself, read books, and try to understand where people are coming from. We really need to, at this time, extend some understanding and grace and have some empathy for things that are going on and that are really triggering in the community for many of us. So educate, be empathetic, extend grace. Those things are so important.
I would echo everything Kristen said. The one thing I would continue to emphasize is this is not an all or nothing. This is not one community against the other. This is about all of us, and there is space in between. So this is not an all or nothing.
Yeah, I'm gonna challenge you, Jeremy. Your following is significant. You have created this social architecture and a firm and people that have followed you and love what you've created. The challenge to you is, how do you become present and make sure that you have an influence on these exact same topics with the people that are following you? You have new folks coming into the city. You have people trying to understand, how do they fit into the city and be a part of it and engaged? They want to know, they just don't know what to do. And so the challenge for you is how do you go above and beyond this? And how do you socially architect a new way of us dealing with disparities, with access and exposure? Those are type of things that I think will be an amazing challenge for you as an organization. But I welcome and thank you for including me as a part of this conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate the challenge. I think just personally, the reflection during this time has been constant and consistent of what can we do better. And you know, even sitting here listening today inspires me to think differently. And I think more conversations like that will continue change because you know, I keep learning too. So I appreciate everyone's time today for this, and hopefully we connect outside of this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Kristen, you know, we're going to get a coffee or something someday. So.
We are. I can't wait.
The last question, Kristen, was when are you going to do, are you doing these brunches virtually?
You know, I thought about that, but Magda is super swamped and I'm swamped. So I don't know, but I would love to. I can't wait to connect with everyone again. It's going to be so much fun. I'm looking forward
Excellent.
to it.
Okay. Talk to everyone soon.
Bye.